Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. As usual, I'm recording this podcast on Monday morning, so by the time you hear this, we should all know whether Donald Trump has made good on his threats to bomb all of Iran's electricity infrastructure, and whether Iran, in return, has retaliated by targeting desalination plants throughout the Middle East. If this happens, the situation will have gone from bad to catastrophic. So, with that in mind, and speaking of Donald Trump, I'm actually going to start with a little bit of trivia because these events are sort of well beyond my control and I cannot foresee exactly what's going to happen. But Donald Trump has started making noises along the lines that his trip to China might be delayed because of these unfolding events. But allow me to offer an alternate theory. It's not because of what's going on in the Middle East at the moment, which Trump still calls an excursion, but it's perhaps for more mundane reasons, namely not being able to agree on an agenda between the two sides. This is a fairly simple matter where China said, if the diplomat I spoke to was accurately reporting what was going on, that China was not going to agree to the visit if it was merely a photo op for the US president. And maybe that's where we are. Maybe the US has not been able to come up with a fixed agenda because Trump is distracted. And the Chinese are saying, well, without that, we're not going to agree to a meeting. There's no point meeting if the two leaders are just going to stare at each other and then have some photos taken. So we'll see how that unfolds. And speaking of other things that we have discussed but which are not well appreciated, is the looming shortage of US-made air defense missiles. And we'll get to the Middle East in a moment. Here are a few simple facts. In the 4 years of Ukraine fighting back against the Russian invasion, that country has shot down an estimated 44,000 Shahed drones. These relatively slow-moving things which are now being used widely by Iran in the Middle East. In doing so, Ukraine has fired about 600 Patriot air defense missiles. They save them for high-value targets. I'm not sure how many have been used to shoot down Shaheds, but anyway. And those Patriots, some have come from the US, but other countries, such as Germany and Norway, have donated their Patriots. So the maths on this is stark. Russia currently builds Shaheds at a rate of 400 per day, and aims to lift this to 1,000 per day. Now, last year, the US manufactured 600 PAC-3 Patriot missiles, and while it will lift that rate and hopes to build 2,000 a year by the end of 2027, it will never come close to even a fraction of Shahed-type drones now being easily produced by a number of countries, including very low-tech ones. So to the Middle East, in the first 4 days of the joint Israeli-US attacks on Iran and Iran's counterstrikes, the US itself and allies such as Israel and Saudi Arabia have fired 800 Patriots. So again, this is making the point that they're being depleted at an alarming rate and will not be replaced at anything even remotely approaching the nature of these threats posed by slow-moving but very accurate drones. And Iran, to strike back, obviously, is mainly using missiles and drones because it doesn't have much else in the way of hardware. Its navy was always quite small, and similarly its air force consisted of old, difficult-to-maintain aircraft such as a few US-made F-14s from the 1970s. In the last few days, the UAE alone has experienced, at the time of writing, 1,500 drone attacks and 246 missile strikes. Something that doesn't get reported much is that the US has lost a long-range radar based in Qatar that's worth about $1 billion and another $500 million radar lost in Jordan. These are going to have to be replaced, further putting strain on the US defence budget. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, this is the new face of warfare, something that people watching what's happening in Ukraine have been aware of, but this seems to have been largely ignored by the Australian military. Yes, we have some very welcome and long overdue counter-drone acquisitions at a very small scale, but the overall picture of us buying large, hugely expensive platform remains exactly the same. Those days are over. And let me make this clear, even if Australia had a warship available that we could contribute to Middle Eastern operations, and I don't think we do because of maintenance issues and the overall poor shape of the fleet, such a warship would be hugely vulnerable to Iranian sea and air drones. The entire nature of warfare is changing in front of our eyes with cheap commercial drone technology able to access cheap commercial navigation systems to find their targets with the assistance of AI. But before dealing with that, I thought it was truly bizarre that the announcement that Australia would not be sending a warship was made not by the PM, nor our Defence Minister, Colonel Richard Marles. I refer to his Kentucky National Guard honorary rank, and I do that not to be nasty, but just to remind listeners of his almost childlike devotion to all things US, nor by the Foreign Minister. Instead, the announcement was made by Transport Minister Catherine King, sent out to face the cameras. The reason why? Well, I assume it's because neither the PM, the Foreign Minister, nor Colonel Marles was brave enough to put their names to a statement that risked upsetting the United States. When asked by a journalist about leading coalition personality Andrew Hastie, who, by the way, has a genuine military rank, Hastie calling Donald Trump petulant, a more than reasonable description, I would have thought, the PM could only snarl in his usual way on anything connected with national security, words to the effect of, I'm going to do what's in Australia's best interests, something like that. Now, I would have thought that staying out of the Middle East conflict rather than encouraging it would definitely be in Australia's best interests. There's also been a bit of ongoing stuff about the American submarine sinking an Iranian ship, to what extent Australians were involved, and politicians have been tying themselves in knots trying to explain that while Australians were on board, they didn't participate in the sinking. But for me, this raises the broader question that I've brought up before in these podcasts, in a somewhat theoretical way, I suppose. So let me now say as bluntly as possible, what are the consequences if Australian personnel posted to US platforms, such as ships and submarines, inadvertently participate in war crimes? You see, US Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, a sort of cartoon character, has proudly boasted about getting rid of all those military lawyers and is saying that the US will now do whatever it likes in combat. He recently used the words no quarter, referring to Iran, which means that people trying to surrender will be killed. This is obviously a war crime, and it's a war crime for a couple of good reasons. Firstly, murder is unethical. I think we can all agree on that. But secondly, any sane person would believe that if for whatever reason Australian service personnel or US service personnel had to surrender, that they would not be blown up, machine-gunned or shot in the back of the head by the people that they're trying to surrender to. You see, previously Australians could be reasonably comfortable that the risk of our servicemen and women participating in US war crimes was exceedingly low because both forces had very similar rules of engagement and followed close to identical, very ethical processes to minimise the possibility of civilian casualties. According to Pete Hegseth, all of that's gone. And in addition, Donald Trump has said a series of stupid and outrageous things like, it's better to sink enemy warships and kill all the crew because that's more fun than capturing them. In saying that, Trump was quoting a fictitious military figure, but he makes that sort of stuff up all the time. So again, I am asking our government, have you really thought this through? Are you going to automatically approve of anything done by the US? Unfortunately, I think yes, we are, because certainly Richard Marles is totally in thrall of the United States, and I doubt is even capable of understanding the complexity of the issues I am raising. As for our Prime Minister, he is also disappointingly amply demonstrating an addiction to the taste of US boots and US backside. I'm going to quote on this theme of ethics and legality retired Lieutenant General John Fruin, who wrote in the Australian Strategic Policy Institute journal, The Strategist. You can read it online. He was formerly head of Joint Capabilities, very well thought of. I'll read out a couple of quotes from his article. The first one is, legitimacy is central, especially for coalition operations. For democratic partners, effective use of force must comply with international law and the recognised rules of war if it is to be sustainable at home and credible abroad. Potential contributors will want to understand the legal basis for action, the arrangements that will grant their forces appropriate immunity and protections, and the parameters under which their troops will operate before they commit. These are the foundations upon which trust between governments, militaries, and the public is built. And he continues on a little later in the same article. Effective use of force rests on 5 pillars: clear and limited objectives, legal and moral legitimacy, rigorous prior planning, genuinely committed partners, and inevitably some good luck. History suggests that when the first 4 are in place, nations can often make their own luck. In the ongoing Iran crisis, Trump will need a great deal of good luck to prevent events in and around the Straits of Hormuz from sliding further out of control, because the other 4 pillars appear worryingly weak. Hear, General Fruin. Everyone should have a read of that. And while I'm quoting others, I'll now quote from a report in the Guardian newspaper. The Guardian says, Donald Trump says he is, quote, very surprised Australia has not sent warships to aid in opening the Straits of Hormuz, as the blockade of the key strategic route for global oil supply continues to affect fuel prices. The Guardian quotes Trump as saying, I was surprised, the US president said in Washington on Friday when asked what he took issue with regarding Japan, South Korea and Australia. Well, they should get involved, and I was a little bit surprised that they said no, because we always say yes to them, he told Sky News. Trump did not answer when asked what Australia had said no to. So let's deal with the practicalities of why no one is in a hurry to send warships to the Persian Gulf, even the mighty USN itself. So, class, the question for today: which country without a navy has been able to almost completely wipe out the navy of a much larger opponent? I'll repeat that. Which country without a navy has been able to almost completely destroy the navy of a much larger opponent? Any answers, class? Well, if you said Ukraine, you would be correct. With no navy of its own, apart from a couple of patrol boats, it has managed to sink most of Russia's far larger Black Sea fleet, including its heavily armed 12,000-ton cruiser, the Moskva. Ukraine has been able to make the Black Sea a no-go area for the Russian Navy and has started picking off ships in the Russian shadow fleet of tankers smuggling oil. Some of those strikes against tankers have been more than 1,000 kilometres away in the Mediterranean Sea. Ukraine has perfected the use of systems such as Sea Baby, which is something like a small, remotely controlled kamikaze speedboat with a high level of autonomy and artificial intelligence. And while the Moskva was hit with 1 or 2 older-style sea-skimming missiles, it was distracted by Ukrainian aerial drones in the area and had most of its sensors pointing in the wrong direction. So it's easy to see what might happen in a very narrow waterway like the Hormuz Straits, with Iran controlling one side of it, from almost any point on the coastline, almost from a car with a trailer. They could launch a couple of these small kamikaze drones, put together a few simultaneous launches, and all of a sudden you've got a warship ill-equipped, to deal with a dozen or more fast-moving, very small, explosive-laden ships coming at them from multiple directions and hitting them on the waterline. It is a recipe for military disaster, and the US, let alone a small country like Australia, would have very great difficulty suffering the loss with numerous casualties of a major surface combatant to a small, cheap weapon such as those that are becoming increasingly prolific. And while I've been cross-referencing other platforms such as ASPI and The Guardian, let me do another, the 7 Network. And they recently screened an interview between Tim Lester, a journalist I know very well, who has a lot of interest in defence topics, and John Blackburn, a former Deputy Chief of the Air Force, and F-111 pilot and test pilot and all of that sort of stuff. I know John extremely well, and he has one of the sharpest minds in Canberra and is always worth listening to. In this interview, it's quite long, maybe 30 minutes, but trust me, well worth it, he makes a number of important points, such as AUKUS is an enormous waste of money and that the US can no longer be trusted. He also talks about the lack of fuel security in this country, something he highlighted in a very detailed report way back in 2013. As for AUKUS, will anyone take notice of his views or about the unreliability of the US? Unfortunately, I very much doubt it, because what we have is a mindset within defence and now amongst the politicians that they will only listen to their own advice. They are not interested in opinions expressed in the media. They are not interested in conclusions drawn by think tanks such as ASPI and the Lowy Institute, and they are certainly not interested in the opinions of retired military people, no matter how experienced they are. All of these things are just dismissed as noise, as commentary of no value at all. I think this attitude is totally wrong. All decisions are best informed by as much information as you can gather. It's improved when some of the opinions being expressed are contrary to your own views rather than just reinforcing your existing beliefs. Please watch the John Blackburn interview. It's on YouTube. You can find it quite easily. And I'll just conclude with a few words, since I've been putting the boot into defence, that Andrew Green, the journalist who I frequently mention, now with 7 West Media, he and I went to Adelaide last week to have a look at the Hunter-class frigate program, and I'll be reporting very extensively on that. And we found out, I'm not meant to know any of this, that just 24 hours before the visit went ahead, a senior defence person tried to block the visit happening. In my opinion, outrageous interference, and they had to be overruled at a political level. That overruling didn't come from Defence Minister Richard Marles, but there's not a lot more I can say on that topic. Anyway, I'll be detailing more on this of defence, trying to put a stop once again to a story that would have actually been of great interest, well, it's still going to happen, to the Australian public. They just don't want any information getting out on any topic at all. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.